Oh man, I was saying, I was on a Zoom a couple of days ago, and it was kicking me out. I was taking it personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a big class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we've been doing it on Zoom these first couple weeks of the semester.
Mhm.
So it's interesting. I'll just put it that way.
I definitely heard it. Well, what I'd like to do is introduce you, and then did you get the questions that the students
Yeah, I
prepared?
was going to try and bring them up now. Let's see.
Yeah, they can call it up. So let's
Yeah,
let them
yeah.
screen share, and they'll do it. But I'm glad you got them in advance. But class, Dr. Austin Allen,
Yes.
one of my heroes. So principal of Design Jones, based in New Orleans. Um, you're still the chair, right? The acting chair, right? Right.
Yeah,
Better half is
yeah,
good at
yeah.
research.
Until Diane comes back, yes, still doing it.
Okay, and chair of University of Texas Arlington's landscape architecture program,
Yes.
and one of the few colleagues I know that is a director, is a filmmaker, in addition to landscape architecture. So, Austin, this class is environmental, social equity, and design, environmental justice class, essentially. And we're closing out our conversation about principles of environmental justice, and I've just always been taken by your film and the idea of one's position in the world determining what you see and what you
Yeah.
don't. And it's
Yeah.
just an incredible illustration of that. So really excited to have you for as long as you'd like to stay, but typically in the past, it's been 30 to 45 minutes of this discussion. And yeah, if you got to cut the cord or pull the plug, let us know. If you can stay longer, that's cool too. But we're all really excited that you're
Okay.
with us.
Good enough. Good enough.
With that, I'd like to turn it over to the students.
Okay.
Can
So
you all see this?
We
Okay,
can, yeah.
perfect.
Mhm.
So we've divided our questions into different sections, and so we wanted to start with some introductions. So how did you realize your passion for restoring justice in a landscape? Who or what inspired you to dedicate your career to this? And what is your most, sorry, I can't see the last part, memorable, I'm assuming, project you've worked on within this issue?
boy, I'm going to start backwards. Probably one of the things that I really feel like some kind of you know inspiration behind justice of a project is Gordon Plaza in New Orleans. If you look it up, and we really, I think, in a collaborative way, and Kofi, you were involved, and a number of others in 2016, did a lot to heighten the issue that had been going on for a number of decades, still going on, but I think it's hit some resolution of moving those members who are still alive from a community out of the community they were in, and giving them enough resources to move elsewhere. They were, because of segregation, they were told that there was a neighborhood development that would happen, and it would be the equivalent of a middle class suburb for African Americans, and the housing certainly looked like it. The surface landscape certainly looked like it in the 1970s when this was done. And people moved in with that ideal of, we'll do the 30-year mortgage and settle on in and, look for that American dream there. What they hadn't been told is that for decades and decades upon decades, it was the city landfill. And it closed at one point. And then Hurricane Betsy happened in '65. They opened it up again and put refuge in it from the hurricane, and then capped it and then went on. The problem with this landfill was that everything was dumped in it over, good time period, a century of dumping. And it was so bad that at a certain point, the rats coming out of it was felt, I think it was the bubonic plague, was the fear of that was going to take over New Orleans. And the US government said that if they did not deal with the rats coming out of there, that they were going to shut the city down from the rest of the country because of the fear of the bubonic plague. So what happened was every day they would pour oil or, recycled oil or kerosene or whatever over the whole field and set it afire every day. So it was a continual fire going on there. And that was how, they were contending with the rats. So you had a situation where, the cancer rate, as you can imagine, just went off the charts. People who moved in there. There was a elementary school that was open there and then closed within a decade. It was closed because the pipes underground all rusted out and blue stuff would come up and all kinds of stuff was going on. And all that had that kind of tragedy. There were lawsuits, other things happened, and just it showed the complication that these things are not cut and dry, easy resolvable, and the embarrassment of what happened with the intention of providing African Americans a supposedly a quality of a life advancement just made it even worse. And so a number of activists have taken this on over the years, and what they were able to do just recently is that there is some talk of a federally subsidized settlement for people being relocated. There was a talk recently between the mayor and the secretary of, I think the HUD secretary, something to that degree. And so I feel like this will be resolved. It's one of those things where in spite of a lot of other things you feel, that was one of those things that had that. Also work that I've done in the lower Ninth Ward and New Orleans, and even for a short time, some of the things that I was able to do for a short while in Haiti. Certainly, I think if I can say anything about all three of those, they were great experiences for my education, okay? And as opposed to, oh, I did all these things, they were great experiences for really keeping the passion alive and really understanding where people were coming from. I'm gonna shut something that's making a lot of noise. Hold on for a second. But I really felt like those have been, some of the things in recent years, at least, that have been there. But how did I realize my passion for restoring justice in landscape originally with claiming open spaces? Is it was the more I learned about the profession of landscape architecture, I really began to understand that landscape architecture could be that kind of vehicle to tell the story. And at the same time, I started falling in love with film. And so the two had a convergence, if you will, and particularly when I knew the park that I knew as a teenager was going away, I felt like I had a responsibility to at least bring that issue to the forefront. And that's how I got inspired with that. It was funny that for me, I was talking about this the other day with somebody that, many of the firms in Columbus, Ohio, where I had asked to come to work, I had already, completed my work at Berkeley, and I was asking to come to work. They weren't interested until this came about. And the the dynamics of the issue were one where a number of firms were like, well, we would hire you to come in. And something told me, no, the way to come about this is to really be able to tell the story. And I must say that a lot of people began to feel the same way and would give me all kinds of footage and support. I would get phone calls and they say, you don't know me, but I'd like to give you some footage that helps to tell your story. And it would be amazing, in that kind of way, that I just hit on something that I think there was a lot more interest. People hadn't just figured out where they wanted to place that interest at the time. That helps.
Great, thank you so much. And any group member, just jump in for these next ones.
Yeah. So what are key elements to creating a good relationship between the community and local government for the benefit of creating outdoor public spaces? How have you aided in creating these relationships throughout your career? I was just writing about this. This is so interesting. We're talking about actually, and Diane who is partner in the firm and wife, and to me, quite the accomplished landscape architect. She is the lead landscape architect in the firm, make no doubt, about it. We were talking about a project we're working on now that's under construction, the Tamir Rice Memorial. And if you're familiar with the Tamir Rice case, 2014, he was shot to death by a city of Cleveland policeman. He was 12 years old, and you've seen the footage. If you type it in, you see the footage. And it happens in the winter. He's got a toy gun. The police drive up because they've gotten a phone call, and the phone call says there's I think he even said a young boy that and he's got, it may be a gun, but I think it may be a toy, but he's running around pointing around at people. And so the police pull up, and there he is, and immediately what you see is this particular policeman shot him and killed him. Did not ask a question or anything, just shot him and killed him. And the thing is, and this was 2014, and the thing is, it sparked quite a bit of, of things, along with all the other tragedies that happened around that same time. And so we were asked to, as years had gone on, to team up with another landscape architecture firm there in Cleveland. And because of knowing that we could handle this kind of sensitive issue, and really answering the question of how you do this with a local government and with public land. And so we were asked to come in, and first thing that happened was really to develop the relationship with the mother, Miss Rice. So Diane and Miss Rice hit it off. They talked about a lot of things. that really set the groundwork for it. But what was happening, and a lot of people didn't understand this, is that that site was not, as it's pictured in the videos, some isolated place off somewhere. This was a very public space, an elementary school, community fine arts center, a recreation center, all were in the same campus block of that. And so there were witnesses, including his sister, who was shoved to the ground. And, she witnessed her brother being killed and had to lay on the ground there, like some big thing had happened, of him when he in fact was playing in a play area. You know, this became the real set of some tragedies in this. What came out of it though was Miss Rice decided to form a foundation based on the settlement that happened afterwards, and to really dedicate it to trying to do some justice, equity, healing, and understanding, all in one, if we could pull something together and accomplish it. Part of that had to do with how you talk, I think, behind the scenes, in front of things, and the like. We talked to the council people, city council woman. We talked to the mayor's office. We talked to the city attorney's office. There was all kinds of discussions going on multiple layers on how to do this, because this memorial was going to be built on public land. And it had to have the sensitivity that elementary school children, hundreds of them, would go by this memorial every day. So, it became that kind of complicated set of things. And I think it's all in the honesty of relationships that gets you, down the road. When I think the city understood that it was about healing and understanding, it was about, getting past the tragedy and to something deeper, there was an openness for it. And we were able to do quite a bit more in terms of it. I think there is a lot to this field in understanding our role, that we are negotiators. Often what I think has happened over the years is we've been taught as, a profession that, well, somebody else is going to handle that. And then, I'm going to be sensitive in my design, but somebody else will handle the heavy lift, and I'll come in and give you a design to do it, And I think we have a profession that was built to do some of that heavy lifting. We can't do it all, can't do all things by ourselves. No profession can. But I think that from its very founding, we had a lot of the pillars in place that allow us to have that kind of empathy, understanding, and to ask the difficult questions to get to greater design strategies, And I don't think we do it enough, and we don't feel, as a profession enough that we have that charge in front of us, but we do. I felt it, and I know that's how we've approached things in a difficult situation like the lower Ninth Ward, where all kinds of elements are at play. And, then in communities that have been oppressed or erased over the years, you've got the problem of people infighting, And how do you navigate infighting? You know, starts to be a critical part of how you move as designer and trusted designer. And I think, you know, again, it's being clear, it's being honest, um, and knowing that these solutions are difficult. And often the more permanent solutions take a long time. That's why I've started really, you know, I get excited about tactical urbanism and temporary innovations, uh, and even conversations about informality, because I think we've got to at least think two steps in every project. You know, what are we doing in the temporary, and what are we doing, you know, in the longer range of whatever we're planning? And it's within our discipline. You know, when you're planting a tree and when you're showing your work, often you're showing a tree that's 10 or 20 years in growth. And you certainly didn't buy it and put it in at 20 years in growth, unless all the money in the world was into the project. You know, often you're buying a 3-inch caliper if you're lucky, and you know, you're hoping the growth happens in that kind of way. And you know, if things and conditions are right, it will, you know. And that's one of the beauties of our profession, is that we are not only designing for the moment, we're designing for future generations too. You know, one of the ironies about Central Park is that so many people feel that Central Park, you know, that's the part that they left to nature. You know, that rectangle, that's the part, you know, that's the natural part of Manhattan Island. And in fact, it is probably the most designed part of the island, bar none. And that's the beauty of the discipline in that way, and the evolution of what Olmsted was thinking, that, you know, these things will happen in this kind of way. I remember a conversation that I had with Witold Rushinsky. He did a book on Olmsted, and he's done quite a bit of writing. You should look him up sometimes. Good writing on cities, place, real estate, landscape. Anyway, this is when I was in Denver. He came to a park called Cheeseman Park. If you've ever been to Denver, there's a park there. And Olmsted had a minute where he did some design sketches for the park. He's really not the final designer of that park, but he had a heavy influence on that park. And so I'm standing there with students, and we're talking Olmsted, and everybody's having a good Olmsted time. And somebody said, you know, well, if he came today, what would he do, you know, to improve the park? And he pointed to a set of trees that were off on the west side, that, you know, over above those trees are the mountains. And he said, first thing he'd do is chop all these trees down that he planted, because they've grown in the way of the view. And everybody's, you know, gets that shocked look, you know. And but it was this ideal of that, you know, certain things grow at certain rates, and like, and you know, the likelihood is he thinned them out or something, but you know, but it was just a kind of fascinating answer about how we design over decades as landscape architects. But I think it's so important to think in terms of the temporary as well, and the tactical for now, because that's part of this validity that happens with community. You know, what can you do to get us through, you know, the next few months of something, you know, depending on what it is. I can go on this, but I in fact, I'll go on down to the next one. You know, and you all have to stop me because I will, you know, go there in terms of how would you have approached the process in transforming Franklin Park for the AmeriFlora event so as to not disrupt the sacred area the Black community had developed in the park before the event took place? One of the critical things to understand about that was that the intentionality. The designers of AmeriFlora, it was part of a strategy to take the park, all right, and separate it from its current users of that day and make it into some other kind of space, because that whole neighborhood around it was on the map for heavy gentrification, which it did happen. People still come to that park though, in terms of, you know, that memory of place and things. I've been to events since AmeriFlora there. A lot of the big trees died because you can't run bulldozers over them, you know, and they don't die right away. It's, you know, you're gone and 3-4 years later, all of a sudden the big tree just dies and everybody said, oh, that's strange. It's like, no, it wasn't. If you go back at the footage, you see where the bulldozer was parked right under it, you know, for a matter of, you know, months. And it has that kind of impact. But regardless, that's what could have happened in that way. And the fact is that you could see what happens with communities is the resilience, so that when the park was blocked off, if there was a migration of young people going to the streets, basically, and in particular streets, and hanging out. And I'm sure to this day, there are new parks that have taken a lot of that role on, as well as, like I said, people still use Franklin Park in certain ways. But there were grounds like the fairgrounds and other places that absolutely could have used the event. And many people did studies along the river. Later, what would happen that really changed Columbus, because I used to love to say I was from Columbus, as in really from Columbus. and I went back there. I started going back in the 90s, and I could see the change. And one of the big change elements was the Wexner Center for the Arts at Ohio State. And what started happening with the Wexner Center is they would be doing arts events there before they would even open in New York. And so you could see that there was this shift going on in terms of the city seeing itself in an importance. But one of the big things that happened was really the city began to reinvent itself along its river. The Scioto River runs through downtown Columbus, and now it's very accessible. What many people had believed should have happened is that AmeriFlora should have happened along that riverfront back then. And I think the city would have been that further along in its own development, because later it did. And it's made it one of the more livable cities in America now. I think in the population growth has gone up. It's like 13th largest city in the United States, something like that. And I mean, it just was not that when this was all going on. And so I think that, you know, it's how the politics of place get tied in with, you know, design strategies. And I think we owe it to ourselves to ask the more difficult questions of what developers are up to. That doesn't mean you paint them as, okay, there's these bad guys, good guys, you know. It's just, you know, you just have to really, I think, be aware of it. I was showing the other day in my class, I have a class like this on site design, and it's really teaching a number of architects about what we do as landscape architects, so that architects stop making the same mistakes over and over in terms of not thinking about the context. So if you go online, there's a very interesting video I showed him the other day. My son is very helpful. He'll be like, watch this. He knows what I do. So he's like, watch this, watch that. I'm like, oh man. So this one was, why do billion-dollar condos are half full in Manhattan? Something like that. Came out in December. So it's very current. Wonderful 20 minutes. You won't put it down. And it's all about Central Park. All right. So if you think this is all about real estate, yes, but it's also about place. And it's so interesting how these kinds of developments have happened. And it's all about how public space shapes value into places. So these billion-dollar iconic things are right up against Central Park. And that's the essence of this on 57th Street. You should really take the 20 minutes. You know, it's a something that just gives you, okay, I got to think about this when I'm doing doing projects in the future, you know. See it. How can we expand and develop, renovate existing public spaces over time while still preserving their cultural significance? Do you know of any examples where public spaces have successfully evolved without the loss of the community's culture? I think this is the grand struggle right now for many African-American communities across the country. We're involved in something here in Texas, Diane, myself, and another professor, Dr. Holliday. We were able to get a SOM foundation grant in 2020, at the end of 2020, and really implemented a lot of it last year, where we were looking at Black settlements along the Trinity River. And the importance of that in Texas is these freedmen's towns where ex-slaves could set up life again and thrive, and they did. And so there were at least 5 that we visited. There were many. So this new holiday we have, Juneteenth, that's where it comes out of, these Black settlements. They're the ones that kept that tradition alive year after year after year. And that's why you could see the kind of spirit of it coming out of those kind of settlements. But in those, there is a definite need and feeling to hold on to spaces of cultural significance, because our development strategies in the United States is wipe out this, you know, do the clean slate. And if the clean slate never existed, yet we live with this mythology like the clean slate is such a critical part of who we are. And it's a real tension and problem, because we as a profession then have to really develop the skills to be able to pull back the covers and figure out what has really happened here. And I can't overemphasize the importance of being able to do site analysis and site planning based on that. It is such, I think, a part of our field, and such a wealth of knowledge that comes from it, because then you start to know, well, that's why you can't do that here, or that's why this doesn't make any sense, or that's why this history is disconnected in that way. And these clean slates are happening more and more and more. And so it makes it even more difficult. We need stronger tools, if you will, to go back in time. I mean, one of the wonderful things, in spite of a lot of other things that Google Earth does or Google Pro does is at least it takes you back to 10 years or 15 years in some places wherever they've got satellite images. And you can start to say, well, wait a minute, there was a whole something here, and then it went away. What happened, or those kinds of statements, have that kind of reality, and particularly with rivers, you know, rivers are something that move anyway. Then, worst kind of border is to think you have something stationary with a river. All you know is you're on that side of it. But it reveals so much for us, so much for us, and so much that has become critical in that way. I know of a project I was working on with Southern University when I was teaching at LSU, and it was called it the Baker Canal Corridor Project. And there's this canal that was draining river water from the bayous that put water into the Comite River, which puts water into the Amite River, rather than the Mississippi. Now, as complicated as this sounds, you can see that subtlety in the earth there, and you're like, okay, the Amite drains into Lake Pontchartrain, the Mississippi drains into the Gulf. The difference in this is that sometimes too much water, of course, gets into that Amite River basin because of development that's happened up in that region. So some of the first signs of how to deal with it was this Baker Canal. And so I was working with students in Southern to try and figure out particularly how to maybe naturalize this canal now because of a project that was coming in. This was back 5-6 years ago, called the Comite River Diversion Project. And it's just 3 miles above it. And it was going to, because of all the flooding that has happened over the years, they take water directly from the Comite River over to the Mississippi. If you don't think it's relevant, look at the 1.3 trillion that was passed and authorized for Congress. And recently they said what money was going to end up in the Army Corps that would directly impact Louisiana. 121 million of it is the Comite River Diversion Project, and I'm telling you this because this history will go away. The significance of that canal, the Baker Canal, the significance of how all that gets formulated and all that happens quickly, disappears. And without telling a long story on it, it's an important one. And, it has everything to do with how we shape the land. To me, that's one of those big projects. If you can figure out a way to be involved, you'll get the workout. If you're interested in stormwater, you will definitely get a workout on that one, without a doubt. But it's what we have done in terms of so much in the United States is that kind of erasure. And I loved hearing that term come up a lot over, say, the last 4 or 5 years. I started hearing students say that a lot. And I was like, I like that term, it's because that's exactly what happens. Is it's not just this palimpsest of, okay, let me just leave remnants here and, a little bit of memory and keep running. It is, let me intentionally knock some things out so that you as designers don't even think about, and definitely beyond you as designers, people don't even think about certain things because they've been given a different name and a different, place within the landscape. and we don't do the investigation, and we should, you know. Save you a lot of headaches, you know, and whether it's social, cultural headaches, which you can get, you know, based on things. And, you know, I mean, I look at Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. I mean, that place has sat idle since it got blown up, you know, and that was a testament to design can really go bad, you know. I mean, you've seen Pruitt-Igoe 100 times, whether you know it or not, you know, you've seen the imagery. It's when the buildings are imploded. And yet there's something kind of interesting because it's been left there, you know, for 40 some years or how many years now. It's something kind of interesting. So how do you take that acreage and do something, you know, fascinating for a city in that kind of way, in memory of, and yet, you know, celebration of the environment? Advice for future leaders. Do you have any advice for young professionals as we begin to navigate design solutions in which a community's culture is not being considered, highlighted? Do you have any suggestions as to ways to persuade not only clients, but also other coworkers on making the right decisions to preserve the community's cultural values, especially when they do not align with the simple design solutions? Absolutely. And first of all, you are the advocates of that, you know. It's to recognize your role as advocates, you know, that you have that responsibility. I think if we do legitimate engagement sessions, it comes out in ways that we can't hide it. Often, you know, and we know when we have those engagement sessions where we're checking the box, as people say, you know, do you want one from column A? Do you want from column B? I've got these kind of, you know, furnishings that could go in, and we got these kind of, you know, when you're doing that, as opposed to what is this space? I mean, what really is this space and how is it used? You know, there's a project we're working on, which is fascinating to me. It's been a park space here in Texas for years. And the way we were first hearing about it from the clients was, you know, the park and recreations there, and was like it was a real disaster. You know, and the disaster is it'd been underfunded for decades because it was in the African American community. But people really liked that park. I mean, and that's what we found out. Every time we would go there and hang, you know, you have to go. As landscape architects, I absolutely believe in, you know, flying drones to get footage, but you got to go on the ground. I don't care what the project is. You've got to put your hand in the soil. You know, you've got to talk to people in that way. And what we quickly found out is people really like the place, you know. And you see the basketball courts and you're like, well, you know, we didn't see anybody out there at this time, and that things happen at different times, different ways. It was a younger person though that went on Instagram, because I don't go on Instagram, and the other firm that was working on it, the older people didn't go on Instagram, but a younger person did, and said, well, look at this. And they had this giant skate party at the basketball court. Yeah, I mean, with DJ, everything. I'm just like, this is a multi-use space. If somebody had not said that, you know, you could almost say, well, maybe we, you know, remove or change the basketball court or some other ridiculous thing. I'm like, no, this is a multi-use. Hundreds of young people use this space when they want to. not when we have decided to show up and do something. It is at their occasions, and they have ways of organizing it for themselves. And then there was a whole set of older people who are like the eyes and ears of the park. And they sit over in the corner and you think, well, what are they doing? No, this is their park. They can tell you, oh yeah, we do these kind of shows here. This kind of thing happens here. And the young people come in and everybody speaks to them because it is a neighborhood park. It is understood in that kind of way, which is fascinating. But so I think one of the things you do for co-workers is you take them to lunch. You're like, let's go to the site. Let's grab some lunch and let's go to the site. And let's really see what's going on. Whatever that is. And you're gonna see it different. You're gonna think about it differently. You're gonna interact with each other in such a different kind of energy in that kind of way. And at the same time, you got to let people come to what they've got to come to on their own too. If you know how that goes. If I tell you every day in class do something, years from now you may do it. I know how that goes. You're like, I'm not. And that's the beauty of what goes on. One of the things for me that is going on generationally that is so strong that I think is so important is this kind of new use of media. And this gets back to, claiming open spaces. I use, and it's not because I don't like writing. I do like writing and reading, but I evaluate classes through what I call digital essay, which is small documentaries, if you will. I'm not interested in the papers, not now at least in terms of it. And the reason is because you are being trained to really use all these elements in your design processes. And then we kind of ask you to step backwards often, I think, and say, well, then write me 20 pages on this. And I think it's a move backwards because I don't think it's like a refusal to read. I think it's that you pick up so much more generationally through so many different things bombarding you. I think our real problem in terms of the media right now is literacy. And we felt that for years, which is that, in filmmaking, that, and, how you decide to fall on that is, often a moral decision, but, filmmaking is this understanding that, there is a narrative going on and the literacy of it is really an important part of the equation. I think it's one of the reasons advertisement as a multi-billion-dollar industry works is really often through illiteracy. Not that people aren't enjoying what they see or laughing at the right moments and things like that, but seeing how emotionally they're being sutured into different things, and not enough of okay, let me step back for a minute. I really don't need that new Subaru, even though, boy, it's up in the mountains where I want to be right now and doing the things that I want to do. And I mean, just feels comfortable. Plus giving money to social causes I would give it to. Yeah, let me go get that new Subaru. I mean, we don't do that enough to ourselves and say, look, all those things are enjoyable, all those things, but they're not necessarily that kind of connection. But And in fact, what I've done often is, you know, in classes is have people do commercials, you know, and make it around something like climate change or some other thing, you know, because what I want is more that you start to incorporate how these tools work and use them to benefit the very things that you're asking for here, you know, um, and not like a Machiavellian, I'm gonna manipulate the public. It's more of, you know, I'm designing in a way, but to really articulate what I'm up to as a design, I'm gonna use all these tools to tell the narrative and things. There's this one gentleman, Kobe, you might know, Brown, he's an architect. I think he's at Princeton now, something like that. I know he went east, or maybe it's, yeah, but he was out of
Was he at
Chicago.
Chicago at one time? Was
Yeah,
he at Illinois?
yeah.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, so one of the things I liked in his strategies, I saw a presentation of his, and I really liked it, is he would do these videos, and it was of projects that were going to happen in the future. And the first thing was that he wasn't getting, nobody was hiring him. Okay, so let's just cut to the chase. He wasn't getting hired, and so he's like, I don't have to see myself as, you know, a dead end here. If I had the opportunity, this is how I would design it. So he started to do these videos that really looked like, you know, the project was done, and 20 years later, in the year 2040, this is what everybody was seeing, and this is why, and this was my approach. And it, like I said, he's teaching somewhere like Princeton now. So, I mean, it worked. Okay, I'll put it that way. It really worked, because what people could begin to see is his imaginary sense of how the world could shift, you know. And it wasn't like, well, what did you build yesterday? You know, I didn't, because I couldn't get a job, you know. You know, it was, he flipped it around in that way, which was an interesting thing. I'm not advocating that's what everybody should do. I just saw that as one thing that happened with media. And I just think that you all are so capable of telling broader stories, broader narratives, bringing things to people in ways that they haven't even, you know, had the time to really think about, you know. And I get fascinated with a lot of Kofi, like your studio that was, you know, that had these other scenarios going where, I mean, it gives people the moment to imagine themselves differently, you know, and to hold on to places then. Because one of the reasons gentrification works is that money becomes the leading conversation, and that the ideal of place has no value. That's how it works. It's like, okay, I bought this house for $50,000. Now you're going to offer me 300,000. How can I turn that down? Well, that's because nobody put that money value that said, you know, the minute you sell that, you're probably selling millions of dollars worth of what it takes to build community, you know. And we, you know, the person walks off and thinks they got the better part of a deal. Does that help?
Fantastic. I'm glad you were able to make that connection back, because I think that's one of the first times we met was you were doing um, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You had your class doing those speculative, uh, fictional sort of montage videos, clipping
Yeah.
sort of dystopian futures from You had all kinds of stuff in there, you know, so it was just really, you're right about the medium. We haven't caught up to the power of the medium yet. We're still grappling with it.
Yeah. And in that, Kobe, you know, I thought like generationally, I was being told something. All of a sudden, I saw these dystopia films back in about
Mhm.
02, 08, children
Children
of
of Man,
men,
yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
28 days, all that. And I was just like, what is going on in people's heads, you know? And I realized they were just telling us, from our point of view, I don't know, this is going to be a rough ride.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it was a heads up from the future.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know,
Well, that's
yeah.
great. Well, you know, I think we've reached the end of the written questions. Just wanted to open it up to the rest of the class.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. If there was anybody that had one they wanted to
COVID
offer.
day, I will talk on and on. So you got to stop me.
No, it's a treat. One day we'll just do it in person again. It was so good to be with
Yeah.
you in Nashville a couple months ago.
Yeah.
That was a while ago. Anything from the class? Anybody want to jump in and offer something while our students with us?
I had kind of a moment when watching the video. People were talking about having to move onto sidewalks because the park was being renovated in Columbus. And thinking about timelines, this was all happening at the same time that the crime bill came about and policing became more intense, even more intense. And I was just wondering if there really was a synergy between those two moments, when like losing park space and increased policing on the streets.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the same activity in a park space reads completely different than on a roadway. And I mean, if you go back to what happened in, is it Michael Brown? And I mean, all this imagery of on these streets, things happen, you know, and it seems so different than in the park. That was one of the things. It wasn't that, you know, violence and other things didn't happen back then or something, you know. No, it did, you know, but in the park, no. You know, it was like a kind of moment of relief almost for people that, you know, if you go to the park, you know, people, you know, minor altercations might happen on occasion, but that wasn't the place, you know, and you would be told, you know, that wasn't the place, you know. It was just a different thing. If you drove on a Sunday into Franklin Park on a summer Sunday and you were driving and you drove in, you were planning that your car would move inches per hour. All right. I mean, you just couldn't get through. All right. It was intentional, in other words, because that was the kind of space and the kind of ritual that was going on there. Streets read differently, had that different thing going on. And I think they directly, your sensibility about the crime bill and all that had everything to do with that, because so much was transforming because of the crack epidemic really coming full speed at that same time in that kind of way. I think it's, you know, it's worth being explored even more, you know, that happened.
Yeah.
And there are these time periods where these things go on. I don't know if you've ever watched this series, Small Axe, AXE. It's a,
Amazon Prime, yeah.
yeah, a good series worth watching in England, not just London, but I think Birmingham and other places. And you remember that a lot of the urban revolts that happened in the United States in the 60s and 70s really go 70s, 80s in London, and you can start to see some kernels of the whys and wherefores as that opens up. It's this changing landscape, you know, this thing of changing landscape from a very Caribbean sensibility to this other new sensibility that go on, and the connection to it, and you know, and that isn't to say that the others are not as complicated and you know, problematic, but it is to see those movements of time and the way people move through those spaces. I remember in the 70s, there was a film called The Education of Sonny Carson. And one of the things I liked about it was it's really a reflection back of the 50s and 60s. It's shot in the 70s, but they're really using Prospect Park as the backdrop. And so you start to see how utilization of space comes out, and you know, it's about gang violence too, and a number of other things, but in those scenes around Prospect Park, they're interesting, and it's interesting to see how people claim these kind of territories in that kind of way as they are being transformed, moving into the urban, you know, from the rural, you know.
Yeah. I think we got time for one more. If anybody else has a question, it was a good question.
You can
I
ask.
can jump in.
Yeah,
Go
good.
Yeah. It's just thinking about Design Jones and what you were talking about with the element of kind of building relationships as a foundation of your work with communities. And I was curious, because of the time that takes and I guess, the slowness of it, do you all work on a different timeline than a lot of other firms? How do you approach that kind of long-term rootedness that would take?
I think we do work on a different timeline and schedule, and probably would be frowned upon on certain projects, you know, like, you know, because you often hear people talk about, look, we can do that in 2 engagement sessions as opposed to 4. You know, we can, you know, maybe we skip doing this part just and go to this other thing. And it's attractive from a business standpoint, you know, initially to say, yeah, sure, you know, let's skip that and go right to it. But you ultimately pay in the end. And I guess that because of knowing this, you know, we don't mind putting the time in, you know, in the front end, you know, in that kind of way. It's often tension between us and the client in that way, you know. So you're right, you know, and you have to figure that one out, you know, just to be able to stay engaged in it, you know. But it's somewhere in there, it all becomes worth it, though. It really does. I feel, you know.
That's great. That's great. And so you're getting a double dose of Jones Allen today, because assigned reading was City of the Dead, Diane's paper, yeah, about Mount
Yeah.
Auburn. So
Yeah.
you got the man in person and
Yeah,
and the lady in writing. So it's good.
definitely.
Austin, always great.
Always
Thank
glad
you.
to do it.
Absolutely.
And be down that way sometime when all this goes to another level, you know.
No disrespect, but I ain't going to Texas right now. So. But yeah, an open invitation.
All right. All right. I hear that.
Take care, man.
All right now.
All
Y'all
right.
have a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Any reflections in conversation with Austin? Or we move on. And if you check the chat, there's a link to access. It looks like a lot of you are already in the slideshow. And then the slideshow, there's a couple of links, including the link on the last slide, which will be a class activity to close out this section. And I think we'll be out of here by 8. All right, no reflections.
I have a question for generally the class and for you, Kofi. It's kind of in regarding to what Austin was saying about authentic conversations when it comes to some of the bigger issues, especially when you think about like local governments and some hurdles that you may come up with or you may face. And just how do you hone that tool of negotiation as a designer? You know, what skills should we be working on now to be better prepared for those situations?
You know what? That's a really good question. And I think you'll get different answers from different people. And what I recommend, Jen, is to hold that question and ask it from our guests and see how they respond, because I think they all have some insight with that. There are different schools of thought on it. I think that, in my opinion, we all have a role. It's like an ecosystem. There's actually an ecosystem model of social movements and social change. And if people are interested in that, I can share that, where we all have different roles. And so I think that people who, for example, have high technical skills and training in design and planning, the role is to apply that to the situation at hand, and in which cases, sometimes you're in a position where you got leadership, loud voice, seat at the table. But I think there's a certain amount of credibility that comes from not just the advocacy of an issue, but the technical know-how to actually propose a strategy and a solution. Our good friend and colleague, Andy Fox, who directs the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab, has kind of put a premium on this idea of you gain more influence in decision-making because you can demonstrate how the skills that you have fill a niche and provide value and can build capacity, and it grows incrementally. So in terms of his model of change, that's how it is. But in terms of in school, with these authentic conversations, and you'll hear different attitudes about that. Mine is to listen first. So, we're often in an extractive mode of trying to, there was a question about how do you build the time? I can't remember, maybe it was Evan who asked that question. Build the time in the practice model to engage in those conversations. But I think that even in a short period of time is placing community and client in a position where they are in their own voice, articulating and talking about what the issues are from their perspective, in their position. So I think there's sort of it starts with sort of that first reaction as to how do we enable people to feel like we don't have to tell them what to do, and we don't have to steer them into a process they may not understand. Or how do we start more organically with people, starting with their own experiences. So storytelling, oral history and narrative, different ways of documenting and talking about things. So I think that's a skill we could start to build even in school. And that connects to community psychology, to cultural anthropology. Like all those people will tell you, if you go to a community you don't know or you don't have a relationship with, you probably just need to shut up and listen and watch and be in a descriptive mode and not prescriptive or interpretive mode, right? So you're just sort of taking information in, and then based on what you're taking in, it starts to go through filters. And the filters come from whatever your professional training and background is. So with authentic conversations, I think a lot of communities are used to people coming in and telling them what to do. It changes the nature of the engagement when you listen. And then there's evidence of listening, right? So there's a feedback loop that needs to happen where you come back and show evidence that you were actually paying attention and you were listening, and that starts to build trust. I do think that with authentic engagement, there's so many communities that have been extracted and abused, intentionally or unintentionally, by the things that we all do, where they go to meetings all the time and they're pouring their heart and their soul out, and then we're telling them it's worth it, and making these pretty drawings or writing these policy papers or whatever. And if you're a consultant, you get paid. If you're academic, you can write a paper on it, get promoted. If you're a student, you get a grade. Community don't get nothing if nothing happens, right? And often in those situations, particularly challenging issues in communities, environmental justice situations, there have been sometimes years and decades of people coming to the neighborhood, starting from scratch. Who do I know? What have I got to do? And so it's exhausting. So I think in a contemporary way, finding ways to make it more reciprocal, where people don't feel like they're giving, it's an exchange, right? So as you're thinking about design strategies or policy strategies, what are things in the near term and the short term that produce some sort of material benefit to the community you're serving, as you're waiting to build the evidence case and do the due diligence and thinking through more complicated strategies. So what I'm noticing in different areas are these really fast feedback loops. Real basic one, some particularly public health professionals, they pay. Like, people don't go to meetings for free. Like, they get paid living wage because you're getting paid. Everybody's getting paid. So even if nothing happens, at least there's a material benefit, immediate material benefit from participation. Childcare, food, using the platforms that we have in institutions or other organizations with more capacity to amplify community voices, networking, leveraging our networks to connect them to resources. So it's not always sort of money, but there are other things that we can do, like at the same time as we're trying to solve big, complicated problems. So I think there's a litany of them, but in my opinion, there's a pendulum that's shifted. I know there are people from different disciplines and backgrounds in this class, so I'm just for a minute just going to pick on my own. There's a period of time when people saw authentic community engagement as a distraction. You couldn't produce good design that way. The anecdote my professor told me was that you get a bunch of people in the room to design a horse and you come out with a camel. The rest of us are sitting there like, well, camels are better than horses, But the goal is that you lose your clarity and intent. You water it down by trying to solve all these unsolvable community issues, waste of time, right? That was that mentality. So if your goal in design is purity and clarity, community process is really hard. But if you are open to adapting to situations and you have the capacity to do so, so that you're co-creating and co-evolving, there's more reward, personal reward. I'm not going to say monetary. We're still working out the economics of it. But the pendulum then shifted, right? So now there's a lot of, every profession I could think of is like, either embarrassed, shocked, or anxious about what happened in the last 2 years. So we got to hustle. How are we going to get more folks in the room? How are we going to get them seat at the table? But there's this tension now in terms of like how much we're willing to adapt our processes, and not just use the moment to look at these communities as new clients, to increase our influence and power without any transformation. So we're in a really pivotal moment now, where some people are afraid there's a retrenchment of corporate interests, right? In fact, I've had this conversation with leading landscape architects about environmental justice. We'll touch on it a bit next week, where they just see it as another market segment. They're not transform at all. The issue is these people need our services because we can solve that problem. But when you really dig into issues of equity and justice, there is a transformation process that's required because you're trying to instigate transformational change, not transactional changes. So, I think you're getting a different answer, Jen, based on how you asked, but I would hold on to that question. I think that's a great question to ask everybody because you'll get a diversity of opinions based on what people's positions are. It's a great question. Thank you. Okay, dokie. Let's go through some slides. Can you all see my screen? All right. So we talked a bit about the garden. And I'll talk to Austin, but we need like a film list, of that all more contemporary way of expressing in soundbite form and fashion what's going on. I'm sorry you all are depressed. The sunny side is that they are still alive. They're still working. They just had to change their site. So if there's a silver lining to this, it didn't destroy this particular group, but they're still progressing. And last class, we talked about power mapping, a way of visualizing power and relationships in different ways, which plays out in different ways. And I think you all have shared, at least in the folder, your attempts at the garden one, and we started with a simple example of quadrant analysis in response to student pressure, decided to do a Marvel movie the same way. So just for your edification, the Eternals, which is one of the more recent Marvel movies. You have the Celestial is clearly the most powerful and the most in favor of the destruction of Earth. Why? Because these competing values. If we destroy the Earth, it births anew the Celestial. So for the loss of billions of people, we gain billions of solar systems, right? This is a real quandary. What do you do, right? So that's the Celestial way up in the upper right, is infinitely powerful. The middle is this new Celestial emerging from the Earth. That's leading to its destruction. You got ranges of power and ranges of agreement and disagreement. Probably the second most powerful and the most strongly agreeing, we're like, no, this Earth is toast, is Icarus, who, it's a comic book. Jack Kirby is my guy historically, but it's kind of stupid. Who literally flies into the sun at the end, realizing the error of his ways, which is pretty much on the nose. The most powerful and opposing side is Cersei. Her ability to transmute matter was critical to defeating the growth of that particular Celestial, and she had a bunch of allies, including who people thought were the villains, the deviants, right? So the people that they were created to destroy, they actually shared common cause, and that might happen sometimes as you start to power map some of these issues of equity and justice. Who is resolved is that you think people are on opposite sides, but when you really look at the relationships, no, actually you're on the same side. You may have different shades and angles with what that's about, but no, really not. Poor Sprite, least powerful, but found her way at the end of the movie, and everybody else is kind of on the spectrum in between. So we can move on from that. But there's another way of looking at it, and I think that's one reason why I wanted to talk about film and representation in media and invite Austin and have you all watch The Garden, is positionality, and that's the theme and the keyword of the readings this week, is that we don't all see the world the same way. We often don't talk about that with regards to equity and justice. We talk about it more in a clinical, technical, spatial kind of way. We very rarely talk about perception, which I think is critical, because if there's a theme with the readings, the level of connectedness you have with the environment from where you're from, no matter where you're from, impacts your level of agency, right? Your connection to that place drives your willingness to take risks to protect it or to heal it. So this will resolve in a question of asking us who we are, and what our lenses are, and just as a starting point, because visual preference surveys were talked about a bit. I'm going to try to launch this poll. It's a very simple poll. Which image do you prefer? 1 or A, or 2, which is B? I screwed up the coding on that thing. Interesting. Whoa. Now that's interesting. That is interesting. We're exactly 50-50. That's really, really interesting. Not something I was expecting to see. Yeah, right. I'm thinking the same thing. Wow. We're the whole country is divided, So, getting to that, we can get into some of the readings. So this is Diane Jones Allen. This is Austin's better half. She is currently doing a research fellowship at Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C., but is the design principal, Design Jones, and is also usually the chair at UNT Arlington. But how nice to have a spouse who can step in for you at that position while you kind of do your thing. So they have a good relationship. Point I'm making. The City of the Dead, written in 2011. Some questions, and because of time, we may just accelerate through this. She's trying to get at why is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Baltimore significant, and then why is the cemetery at risk? And what she arrives at is a lack of recognition of all of the elements that infuse it with value that are not aesthetic in terms of our formal sense of aesthetics, and that's important, particularly as designers, to consider that. Real Mount Auburn, so to speak, first Mount Auburn is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's an actual photo of it. It's beautiful. I interned in Cambridge when I was in grad school at Carroll Johnson Associates, and it's basically a park. And that's something to know about cemeteries in the United States. The rural aesthetic of cemeteries, those were the original parks. So if you imagine people hanging out in cemeteries like they do in parks, sounds creepy. But that's what people used to do before public parks in the United States. Mount Auburn Cemetery is one of the shining stars of that. The curving paths, the shaping of topography, the manicured landscapes, and high maintenance places, and places for elites, essentially. That's sort of our model, right? So when we think about aesthetics and types, and a number of you study typologies, you're comparing, if things are a type, you're comparing one to another. But what Diane starts to introduce is this idea of, without an understanding of cultural context, rituals and meaning, that we could misconstrue a site like this. This is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Baltimore as a place of no value, place of abandonment, place of ruin that doesn't have the same value. And so she tries to connect us to those rituals and those stories, traditions that are tied to a different type, which is African burial grounds, particularly in rural areas, and the idea that this represents sort of those rural values being in the city, and the fact that the city grew up around it as being one of these last oases or one of these last places where that occurs. So this idea that sometimes our position, which determines our sense of things, when applied to interpret something we don't understand, we can miss it and devalue it and think that it's not important. She has images in her article contrasting the two. So even Mount Auburn Cemetery plan view in Cambridge, winding paths, heavily canopied, manicured gardens, well integrated into its community, its edges. And then contrast that in plan view with what we have at Mount Auburn, which, just politely will say is more utilitarian sort of plan, where we don't have all of those conventions we associate with cemetery, which puts designers kind of in a shock moment of like, well, what am I supposed to do with this place? Also talks about the attraction of locally unwanted land uses and the impositions of infrastructure and other things, sort of fragmenting it, and making it harder for people in the community to continue those particular rituals. So we didn't talk about this aspect of Bullard last week, but he has a term that he calls LULUs, LULU, locally unwanted land uses, and how they tend to accumulate in communities that are perceived as low value in his mind, Black and Brown communities. So in addition to the conspiracy of citing toxic facilities and noxious uses intentionally in these communities, they also tend to attract and accrue these things over time. So, it reminded me of work we've done for many years in South Park neighborhood of Raleigh, and the value of time. And so Austin even referenced this in his remarks. It's really interesting to try and find historic imagery in historic aerials places to see how they've transformed, what's changed. And what we've found, in that series of small diagrams on the right, starting with 1939 and then moving to, in this case, 2010, was streets and infrastructure fragmenting this neighborhood over time, where it used to straddle long distances north-south. And just the irony of ironies, the biggest rupture in the community was Martin Luther King Boulevard. So, you know, splitting these historic and traditional connections north and south. But how one domino tips and then everything starts to unravel is sort of part of that story that's being discussed and talked about. Yes, locally unwanted land uses. It's even fun to say. And what Austin didn't talk about is we're both working with field operations right now on reimagining the Middle Branch, which is the community on the Middle Branch Harbor, where Mount Auburn Cemetery is. And so we'll talk a little bit about that next week in terms of some things we're trying to do to infuse issues of justice and equity as a lens into the planning of this project. It's a crazy story. So some people who've had me in class before, I've told this story, and it's a nutty story. But there are some attempts right now to go back and deal with it in more substantial ways. There's a link to that project in that particular slide. The other reading came from Dorcita, racial and ethnic differences and connectedness to nature and landscape preferences among college students. You know, she thought it was interesting that a lot of what we know about preference, visual preference of landscapes, when the exercise we did where it was 50-50, right? It's class, urban street, you know, woods with a path. We're split right down the middle. Is that those typically happen in communities, they happen with other folks, but very rarely with students. And what she was really interested in was finding an environmental justice framework to that analysis, because there are a lot of assumptions about race, ethnicity, and preference. So mainstream ideas of landscape perception, we'll talk about what those are briefly. It'll borrow from my theory class, but I think it'll help because she's critiquing people in the same building, like Rachel Kaplan is like 2 doors down. Well, when she was at Michigan, it was 2 doors down from her. So this idea of what is environmental perception, what drives it, when we think about it in the context of environmental justice, how does that transform and change? And you know, why does she argue that connectedness to nature matters to perception? So please forgive the text that's not correct. I'll delete it once I get out of here. But that diagram is really important because the whole principle of environmental psychology, which is referenced in Taylor's article, comes from biophilia and these innate adapted responses to environments, that even though we are in a more urban or suburban or technology dominant habitat, we are still animals. And so we have been conditioned for thousands and thousands of years to respond to different stimuli in different ways. And in our brains, there's like this immediate sort of human response to things. And so that's the birth of environmental psychology. How do we describe that, quantify it, code it? Gibson gives us the theory of affordances, which is to say when we see and experience different places, we are instantly, because of our human habitat mindset, thinking about what kind of activities do they afford us, right? And which don't. So that model gets to it. So I'll nix that text so it's a clean one. There's Rachel herself. So when I was at Michigan, she was there with her husband. So we've got like happy couples today. That seems to be a thing. But Stephen and Rachel Kaplan really pioneered the language of landscape preference and talked about these different domains, you know, quick takes. We want to sort of get a quick take and understanding of an environment. So our brain works rapidly to see if there are patterns. And then based on those patterns, we're willing to go further and explore into those landscapes. The point is that Rachel's theory is very strong, even to the point where they've used a lot of these ideas for internet web design, navigating different places in a virtual domain. A lot of it traces back to a lot of stuff even Rachel did. But the point I want to make is that it assumes the universal human, right? That in fact, these are innate, not taught responses that we respond to. So this is what Dorcita is criticizing. And the point I want to make is that if you follow Rachel and Stephen's research, the most preferred landscape in the world is a meadow going towards the woods. even in places where there's no meadows, no woods. They've done this in places where there's nothing but ice or desert or coast or mountains. Every time, this is the one. And this is what they use as some sort of evidence because they think that this is tied to this ecotone, where two systems are coming together, where our genetic ancestors emerged. But what Rosita's challenging is her mind bias and stereotypes about what the preferences of different landscapes happen to be based on race. Going into it, even with Rachel and Stephen's studies, was associating Black and Brown communities with preferring orderly, structured urban environments to what you might call wild or naturalistic environments. When in fact, the most preferred environment cross-culturally, at least from her sample size, was woods. And there were contextual reasons why people preferred or didn't prefer things like scenes with wildlife and other things. And she talks about those as situational. So learned behavior and habits rather than innate genetic responses based on previous experiences, perception of crime, fear of getting hurt, like real things, So it starts to talk about the role of power, the role of lived experience, not just innate human experiences for preference. And why this matters is that, you're going to run into a lot of situations where you're going to be grappling with what people prefer, right? What kind of landscapes they value, which kinds they don't. And the more that we can engage people to have them either tell stories in the manner of Austin and the oral tradition, or make decisions, based on responses to imagery, or other forms of it, we can be lost. And connectedness seems to be the thing. So just to close that loop with Rosita Taylor, that people who reported feeling a sense of connectedness to their environments, natural environments, it activated and connected these other preferences. And in terms of connections, there's a lot of people who are connected. So we'll close with a few figures. Catherine Coleman Flowers, the great advocate from Alabama, the great book, Waste, talks about Loudoun County in rural Alabama, where horrible environmental injustice issues are faced by that community today. The insufficiency of infrastructure, particularly sanitary waste. The reemergence of diseases that were once eradicated in the United States that they thought were extinct because of people's persistent exposure to toxic soil and toxic water. But what's interesting about her story is, she talks quite a bit about generational connections to the land. She talks about the influence of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and their manner of organizing and how they rallied rural people in Alabama as something that's transferable to advocating for issues of environmental justice. She connects with the Equal Justice Initiative and their idea. She actually works for the Equal Justice Initiative for a period of time before turning those skills towards advocating for those equal rights. She was a MacArthur Fellow 2 years ago and was really one of the great champions, current champions. But this type of rootedness in terms of like agricultural lifestyle, rural lifestyle, but also rootedness in terms of organizing, that level of connectedness gave her a sense of agency and power to move forward on that. Majora Carter, who we'll probably visit next week, founder of Sustainable South Bronx, native South Bronx in New York, who went away to college, I think wanted to be an actor, came back, brother tragically murdered in the Bronx, triggered this awakening in terms of trying to understand the environmental issues that were contributing to some of the social issues that were happening in the Bronx at that time. Developed Sustainable South Bronx, has no environmental background, training, nothing, but sort of figures it out and has a very strong entrepreneurial spirit because she sees the wave coming. This is the 80s and the 90s of green jobs. The idea that the business of a lot of, at least American cities, for some time is going to be retrofitting our infrastructure. and that those might provide sustainable green job opportunities for people who have been excluded from other pathways. So everything from certifications for green roof installations, solar cell installations, rain garden construction, conversions of streets, converting what were once industrial waterfronts in the Bronx to public parks. She does this, I would say, in a constructively naive way, which is to say it's not expert driven, it's community driven. But that connectedness to a sense of, for me, Generation X, hip hop generation, the South Bronx is like Athens to people in our generation. We're like, that's the birth of hip hop. But, for most people, they associate it with crime and disrepair, social disorder. It's interesting that someone had a totally different perspective of it, kind of held on to its value for maintaining social ties, and then moved into what I call an early adopter, into this space of how do we turn that into economic opportunities. So just a fascinating person, powerful speaker too, by the way. So, very strong person. Yeah, and one of my favorite people, Vernice Miller Travis, who's the founder of We Act, West Harlem, who started out as a community activist. And they made the correlation in West Harlem in the 1970s and 1980s, high respiratory disease incidence, lower life expectancy, high mortality tied to air pollution. And this is before the sophisticated monitoring and mapping that we know now, where we can kind of predict what those things are occurring. This is happening bit by bit, block by block. And so in We Act, which is the organization she founded, was one of the early urban environmental justice organizations. So we talked a bit about Warren County and those movements and the rural roots of environmental justice. This is a part of the urban roots of it. But when the EPA did a video series interviewing what they call the pioneers of environmental justice, of which Bernice is one of them. There's a link in the slide if you'd like to hear it. It's only 3 minutes long, where she talks about this transformation that she went through, where this idea of grassroots activism, resistance, fighting was reaching its limits. And she acknowledged as a community activist the constraints of that. And upon herself, decided to go to get an urban planning degree and start to take that lived experience of resistance and combine it with the tools of urban planning. And she felt she was more effective when she did that. So in some cases, the environmental justice critique is in a sense a class critique. So far, we've talked about these resistance movements led by people who don't have the technical access to skills and resources, describing it and having to team and partner in order to get that to happen. And the flip side, a lot of anxiety and guilt from what we might call the professional managerial class, which is us. How can we allow all this stuff to happen and feeling somewhat immobilized by our inaction in that regard? Well, Vernice is sort of the bridge, and sort of a real example of how those two can kind of coexist, and sometimes in the exact same body. So great person, great person. So with that, I'd like to offer an activity, and given the time, we'll do it like we did last time. So just see if you can get to it before next class. We got a really cool professor in college design. So Leslie Ann Noel. She's in graphic design. She got her PhD in design here, but has done a lot of cool work in different places. And one thing she came up with, which I found really interesting, was this idea of how to learn and recognize exclusion. Like when we're not including people and voices. So she's been developing all these really interesting tools to help people sort of make sense of who they are and how they think they define themselves. So in this, there's a link to a concept board, which has this diagram on it. And so we'll talk through it. And this could be the closer for today. Let's see if that link works. It's called the positionality wheel, right? And what it asks us to do is to consider all of these factors that we think define us. So you don't need your names on this stuff. Not trying to out anybody, but it is interesting if you ask, what about you most defines, who you think you are and how you see things? What would you pick? No wrong answers. But the goal is to use the stickies to do that. So the wheel on the left shows the full diagram. Who am I? There are all these different characteristics that are around it. The wheel on the right is exactly the same, but you'll see these sticky notes right next to it. So I think everybody should try and do one using a green sticky note of one characteristic that you think strongly influences how you see the world. It's a bit of an unfair question because I'm sure there are many, but you just pick one. As a second step, if there are others, you can use any other color sticky you want. On the green sticky, we need to know why you think that characteristic is so important to who you are. So the beauty of these things is that you can, with the arrow up top, you click on one, there's stacks, you can move it to wherever you need to. There's a text button that allows you to type anything you want in it. Oh, somebody didn't like what I typed. They deleted it. Do that again. Right. I think it's infinite. Hey. All right. You can resize them, so if it turns out you got a lot to say, or you can shrink them or reshape them, but place it on the spot that you think most strongly defines who you are. You can use any other sticky that you want, and it doesn't require any notes to include other things. But what's interesting is, with her examples and her exercises, knowing a bit about that with groups is helpful, right? You start to see patterns of, people are identifying themselves with different things, and then there are gaps. So maybe, you or the group you're working with or whatever project you're on, you'll find everybody kind of clusters around certain sort of things, but nobody really considers one's level of ability or disability, as an example, or gender, or class, and class is like the secret one. Or some people really influenced by things that happened when they were children, and they're still dealing with some of those issues. So what's interesting is what's included, but what's really interesting about most analysis is what's excluded. And it's the parts that are excluded that become the opportunities to see who is in the center and who's in the margin as we start to deal with things. So not graded, it's just an experiment. It's a way to salute Rising Star, who's dealing with these new tools, Dr. Noel. But give it a shot, because I think that part of this couplet, there are a lot of different ways to talk about principles and environmental justices. There are real things, right? People dealing with geography, dealing with life expectancy, a lot of heavy stuff. But there's also what's central to it is, in terms of the principles, is that people in these communities that are facing these issues, we find ways to help them speak for themselves. And part of that is understanding positions, having them articulate them, and then as us, as designers, for us to articulate them as well. So we have a fuller understanding of who we are and how we relate to one another. So I encourage you to give it a shot. I'll take a look at it between now and next week and point out anything that seems kind of interesting. But a new tool for your kit. Yeah. And I'll take myself out of it. So I'll leave it to you all. That's the sneaky thing about these apps like Mural and Concept Board, is you can see who's in there working and who's not. Yeah. Surveillance state. But I promise I won't look. And it could be, yeah, in answer to your question, it could be. We don't talk enough about positionality. There's a lot of conversations that happen, around the time of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. What people forget is that he was pretty well off growing up, right? So his father, prominent preacher, could afford to send him to a private school, Morehouse. Went to college when he was 15 years old, traveled the world, was prepared to inherit his father's pulpit in Atlanta, if not for the intervention of his wife, Coretta Scott King, who quietly wanted to get him a little bit away from the influence of his dad. And if you're wondering about the whole nonviolent direct action thing, it was actually her who had written about it and studied it, and was really the one who's, you need to consider this nonviolent direct action stuff. That's how they ended up in Montgomery, was through her connections. But the point I'm making is that sometimes we associate our role in movement and change based on our proximity to the communities that we serve, when in fact that might not be the case. Maybe the case is we understand what our position is and we play our position on the team. So if you have high technical skills and a lot of wealth and political influence, you should probably use that to advance social change, as opposed to people who have other assets and other strengths. So getting a sense of that, of where people are, is helpful. So, yeah. Before we go, any other comments? I'm scanning the questions. Someone came to the rescue on Lulu's. Thank you for that. Sad term, fun to say though. Fun to say. Okay, looks like people are populating this board. This is a really interesting wheel. And it looks like there might be a few that are outside the ring, and that's fantastic. That's even better. Because this is taken directly from Leslie Ann's paper, but we weren't trying to suggest that these are the only categories. There might be other things that you consider that define who you are. So I'm glad that people are taking some initiative to do that. It's good. All right. Nothing else. We'll say thank you.
Thanks, Kofi.